Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. Federal parties have now laid out most of the key planks of their climate platforms, explaining how they would tackle climate change if they were to form government. All this week, we've been speaking to each party about what they plan to do. Today, though, we're turning things over to you. What do you want to know about each of the parties' environmental policies? You can post your questions in the comment section on the CBC News YouTube channel, the Politics Facebook page, or our handle on Twitter is @PNPCBC. We've assembled two experts on climate change policy to answer as many of your questions as we can get through in the next 20 minutes. Joining me from via Skype from Edmonton, Associate Professor at the University of Alberta, Andrew Leach, and in Montreal, the Chair of Canada's Ecofiscal Commission, Chris Regan. Hi to both of you. Great to see you.
Hello.
I have some questions already vis-a-vis Instagram. Gladding Mark, Mr. Regan, I'll start with you, asks, and I'll pick, he asks, are they realistic? And I'll pick one party. Why don't we start with the one who has the most stringent targets, and that's the Green Party. They want to double the targets by 2030 that were already set out.
Well, when I look at the NDP and the Green plans, there's no question that they are quite aggressive. They're quite ambitious in terms of their desire to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. All of the Liberals, NDPs, and Greens are all talking about net zero by 2050. Some of the things that I see in the NDP and the Green parties' plans is that they've got some issues that I think are going to be difficult. So the question is about realism. They're going to be difficult in terms of federal-provincial negotiations. You know, this is about an issue where natural resources are in the provincial domain, environment is largely a shared jurisdiction, and so you need to be thinking about coordination and negotiation between the federal and provincial governments. So some of the issues, for example, if you want to prevent pipelines and prevent new drilling of oil wells, which is one of the things that the Green Party is talking about, it's not clear to me how a federal government actually prevents that from happening. Andrew may know more about that. So my sense is that in order to get public acceptability and get that Fed-Prov negotiation happening, I think the parts of the NDP and the Green Plan are going to be very challenging.
Professor Leach, let me move over to one that's kind of related to that. It's Jake B18 asks, and again, you can narrow it down, you can pick a policy, but how will the climate plans impact the economy?
I think the big one we don't know much about is the Conservative plan. We don't have a great deal of information about what exactly their large emitters plan is. We know that they're going to require investments in new technology. We know that they're going to set limits on emissions and require investments above that. But beyond that, we don't really know. So that's sort of a wild card. And the NDP and the Greens, same idea. We have some very aggressive commitments and, as Chris mentioned, some outcomes they want to see, but we don't really know a lot about the specific policy tools. And so when we want to know what is going to happen with the economy, really that's what we need to know. We need to know what are the tools you're going to use, not what are the outcomes you imagine are going to happen. With the Liberal plan, the policies that are doing the heavy lifting are the ones we already know about, the clean fuel standard and the carbon price. So we have a pretty good idea of what those do to the economy, which is, slightly slower than it probably would be if we had unconstrained greenhouse gas emissions. But in terms of policies to reduce the emissions, if you want to meet Canada's targets, you're getting pretty close to as good as we could do with a policy based on carbon pricing and flexibility.
Can I add something to that, Vassy?
Go for it.
So at the Ecofiscal Commission, we did some modeling on having a carbon price that was rising to above $100 per ton by 2030. And we had a lot of the revenues recycled back. In fact, all of the revenues recycled back in different ways. And what we found on terms of overall economic growth, we found that there was actually very little impact on the economy, really very little. And the key is that the carbon pricing is doing the heavy lifting in terms of emissions reductions, but you get economic benefits back depending on how you actually recycle those revenues. And whether you look at the Liberal plan, where there are rebates going back to households, or even the NDP and the Green plan that are also using those household rebates, or sometimes called dividends, those things can actually really help to minimize the impact on the economy.
The interesting part there is also, though, that you're talking about $100 by a certain day. And so far, all the information we can get out of any party is what they do until 2022. Nobody has really come up with the details of by how much they would raise the price on carbon after that. Henry Brillen, Professor Leach on Facebook, asks, Elizabeth May says she won't support new pipeline projects. How can she say that when she wants to supply the entire country with Albertan oil?
That's the question. She brought that up in Montreal today, and I still haven't seen a clean answer. I think what she's probably going to say is we're just not going to need those refined products, and so we're going to be able to do without them. But there, again, I think a lot of the policies are based on, if you look at a national level, are we going to need as much electricity or as much refined product or what have you, versus what do you need at a very local level? And right now she's talking about banning our crude imports, and all of our crude imports feed basically 2 refineries, Irving and St. John and Valero in Quebec City. And if you take out imports for those refineries, we don't have any other way to get crude to those refineries easily, other than rail, I guess. And so then the question becomes to her, what do you see as the vision for those particular large assets in those particular parts of the country?
I would add to that, Vassy, that one of the things that I think we should be thinking about in terms of climate policy is not just how effective it is at reducing emissions, but how cost effective it is. And hopefully we'll choose low cost ways to do so. Trevor Tombe, a professor of economics at the University of Calgary, has done some work on thinking about pipeline blockage as a way to reduce emissions, and it's an extremely expensive way to reduce emissions. Over $1,000 per ton. So if we can reduce emissions with a carbon price that's way less than that, then blocking pipelines as a way to reduce emissions is certainly debatable.
Here's a bigger question I'll follow up with, Mr. Reagan. Paul Vella on Facebook asks, how can all these parties make promises that they can never reach? I believe in climate change, and I seem to have to choose between crazy plans that will never get put in place and plans that will not reach the Paris targets. I'm stuck like most Canadians. The climate has been turned into an election promise fight. It's too important for that. What do you make of that comment?
Well, I think Canadian governments over the past couple of decades have actually been guilty of making promises and then not implementing policies to actually carry those out or to achieve those objectives. I think the plan that we see in place today, so it's the Liberal Party that's putting the plan, but they're also running on their record of the past 4 years. There is a policy in place. It's made it through that Fed-Prov minefield, if you like.
Sort of.
It's
in the courts right now.
Sort of.
Sort
it's
of.
based largely on provincial carbon pricing, but some federal action only if provinces don't act. That is it's a real plan. It's in place. It's credible. It's not perfect by any means. The Liberal plan doesn't have enough policy to get to the 2030 target, so they're going to have to do more than they've currently got there. But it is the beginning of, I would argue, a good plan. They pay attention to the impact on households. They pay attention to business competitiveness. It's a real plan. It's in place, and it's the beginnings, I think, of a good plan for the future.
Unfortunately, when they announced the rest of their plan, or the targets that they wanted to get to earlier this week, they did not provide many details of the more at all. Professor Leach, I'll get you to weigh in on the same question, and then we'll take a break. Yeah.
There's a great speech that Prime Minister Harper gave in the UK early in his term where he said, we're not going to make the same mistake. We're not going to commit to a target that we can't meet. Here's our Copenhagen target, and then of course we know what happened with that. They didn't meet it. Justin Trudeau basically said we're going to let the Harper targets be our floor. And I think what we're seeing is, right now at best those are a ceiling. And so we've gone and committed to very aggressive targets, which almost makes our policy life more difficult, right? We go out and commit to something that is going to require a massive transformation of our economy. And then, when we fall a little bit short, the impression you get publicly is, oh, well, this is a failure. And I think Chris is exactly right. We've seen a lot of movement. Is it still feasible that we could meet our 2030 target? Absolutely it is. It's going to take more policy, but it's in the mix of possibilities, which is probably the first time that I've been able to say that in 20 years I'm working on this space. Will we be able to meet the 2050 target? That's a harder reach for either the Liberal, NDP, or the Green, or even really the Harper era target that still sort of sits out there of 80% reduction relative to 2005 levels. Those are going to be another, long-term look to a much deeper transformation.
Okay, we've got to take a quick commercial break, but we do have more question and answers coming up. To those who are watching us online, the live stream is actually going to continue in just a few seconds during the commercial break. We'll take more of your questions, and keep those questions coming in the comment section on YouTube, on Facebook, and our Twitter handle at PNPCBC. We're back in a moment. All right, hi everybody, we're back in the commercial. We're going to keep taking some more of your questions. Mr. Reagan, Brent L on Twitter asks, what specifics does each party have building clean energy infrastructure for Canada? And he says the transition needs to start now. So he's talking about clean energy infrastructure. Has anything stuck out to you?
Well, one thing that's common across all four platforms is that they want to build an electric vehicle charging network. So obviously no details, how much is this, how much is it going to cost, how well will it be done? But this is actually probably a pretty good idea, because one of the obstacles for people to buy electric vehicles, well, one obstacle is that they're still expensive, but those prices are coming down. But even if the prices come down, one of the obstacles is what's often called range anxiety. If you're not sure that you can actually get to the next station or find the next station, then it's questionable whether you really want to commit to an electric vehicle. But if we can actually build that infrastructure or help build that infrastructure across the country, that really may increase the take-up rate. So that's one of the things that I noticed.
Okay, quick question to you. I think we have about 30 seconds left. Do any of the platforms plan on tackling waste management issues? Kelly Kramer on Facebook asks. Professor Leach?
I think the only one that addressed that in any great degree was the Conservative platform, but I might have missed a couple. I was concentrated on the climate issues. In the Conservative one, we talk a lot about sewage and waste and stuff, but it's sort of a, hey, look over there type of pivot to that, I think, more than a really in-depth policy on it.
Okay, we're going to take a fade to black and be back on TV in a moment. Welcome back to Power and Politics and to our discussion about climate change. We've been taking your questions about each party's climate plans. A reminder to keep sending them in, and we'll try to answer as many as possible in the next 6 or 7 minutes or so. We've got two experts on deck to talk policy. Chris Reagan of the Eco-Fiscal Commission is in Montreal, and Andrew Leach from the University of Alberta joins us from Edmonton. Mr. Reagan, I'll jump to you. Adam Wynn asks, will there be a stronger structural shift to renewable energy sources to mitigate climate impacts?
Well, I think we need to have that shift or transition. I actually think what we are talking about now are policies at the very beginning of a 4 or 5 or 6 decade transition. So if you believe the science that says, the world has to reduce emissions by something like 80% over the next something like 30 or 40 years, and you recognize how dependent modern societies are on energy and in terms of our energy mix on fossil fuels, it's pretty clear we have to make a pretty serious transition. It's not a transition over 2 years or 5 years. It's a big transition over 50 years. And so that means we need to be thinking about policies that are going to get us there. A carbon price or other climate policies that actually get us to switch away from high carbon energy sources toward low carbon ones will help. That will also lead to transition of workers away from some sectors and into others. And we've seen some people talk, in particular, I've heard Elizabeth May talk about the need to offer transition assistance to workers. So I think we are talking about a big transition in the Canadian economy, and frankly, in every economy in the world over the next 50 years. It's not going to be sudden, it's not going to be discrete, but I think it's it's going to be bit by bit over many years.
Professor Leach, W. Timbers on Instagram asks, any plans for transit users, are plans for transit users and tax credits for home renovations, like enough to reduce the carbon footprint? Like, I guess the overall question is sort of around what kind of impact those measures might have.
I think both of those are important. So renovating houses or buildings and transit or mode shifting is really important. The related question, though, is what policies governments put in to do that. And when you see policies like whether it's the transit pass credit or the home renovation tax credits or the interest-free loans, the issue that you run into with those is that most of the people who collect them are people who would have renovated their house anyway. So that, the best salesperson people for those are the people who are there to fix your furnace and say, hey, you can also get a better furnace, you can add an air conditioner, and there's this rebate. Will get you there. You were already going to make some change, and you end up getting some of it paid for by the government. And so I think that the technology or the deployment that you need in those sectors is really important, but the policies to get there, as Chris might follow up on, tend to be in the hundreds of dollars per ton in terms of the cost per ton of emissions reduced. So the typical economic response would be put the price in place and let people decide individually what's best for them, whether it's renovating their house, changing their mode of transportation, et cetera, and get the emissions reductions that way.
Mr. Reagan, Travis Clark on Facebook asks, do any of the party plans for climate change actually have the potential to alter global trends in climate change?
Great question. Canada's a small country. Canada is producing something like 1.6% of global emissions. This is very much a global problem, and to make it complicated, it's a global collective action problem. We can only solve this problem if the countries of the world come together. So I think Canada's emissions reductions won't make it happen more in the rest of the world, except that Canada can play a very constructive role in those international negotiations, but we can't play a credible and constructive role if we're not doing something at home. I don't think Canadians want to be free riders on the actions of other countries. So I think we need a two-pronged approach. I think we need to be talking to the rest of the world and spurring each other on to that global action, but at the same time doing things at home that make our international presence credible.
H. Mine Institute. Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go for it.
So I think there's another side to it too, which we have to worry about. How do the world's actions on this come to impact Canada? So in the negative sense, we've seen discriminatory policies come from the European Union, arguably from California. Certainly the pipeline file has been very costly to Canada's economy, as Chris mentioned earlier. And so all of these things are reactions to the climate change problem. It's not just this idea of somehow the world's going to act in a coordinated way. What's more likely is they're going to act in an uncoordinated way and take political action that could and often has already impacted Canada. So I think we have to be ready for that. And I think we also have to remember that as the world acts on this, some of our actions become easier, that we can benefit from technology from elsewhere as well as they can benefit from us. And it changes the pull on our resource economy if others are acting. So there's a few other interactions with the global economy that we need to think of as well.
And just have a few seconds left, Mr. Reagan, go for it. Yeah.
Well, just to add to that, there's also policy learning. I mean, we can learn about policies that work well elsewhere and maybe try them out here. I mean, Canada's not the first country to have a carbon price in place. Other countries have it. We've made some learnings from those. And there's a lot of learning, and I think there's going to be a lot of trial and error over many countries over many years, and we should keep an eye open to that.
All right, I got to leave it there. Thank you very much to both of you. Really appreciate the discussion, and thanks to everyone for sending in their questions. Thanks, Chris Reagan and Andrew Leach. Of course, there's no shortage of questions concerning climate policy, so if you have more of them or we didn't get to yours, join Carol McNeil tomorrow for an entire program dedicated to taking your questions on climate. Ask CBC News starts at 8 o'clock Eastern right here on CBC News Network. Tweet your questions to @Carol McNeil. That's tomorrow night. Power and Politics. We'll be right back after this.